North Korea has been in the news a lot lately because of its growing ties with Russia and a string of missile tests. There are big effects on the world's politics because of these events, especially in the growing gap between the West and the global South. In this movie, we'll look more closely at these problems. We will start by looking at North Korea's political history and current strategic situation. Then we will talk about their most recent missile tests. North Korea's strategic alliances with Russia and China, as well as the effects these could have on global geopolitics and Soviet power. In 1945, after World War I, Korea was split in two by the 38th parallel, which was occupied by the Soviet Union and the United States. This marked the start of the Cold War on the peninsula. In the north, the Soviet Union installed Kim Il-sung, a former anti-Japanese guerrilla fighter who created the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in 1948. Kim made big changes, like taking over businesses and giving land to different people, in order to build a socialist state. He also started policies to make the country less dependent on the USSR, which became known as self-reliance. The Korean War happened from 1950 to 1953. In June 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea with the goal of unifying the peninsula under communist rule. This aggression led to a large-scale response from the US-led United Nations forces, and China joined the conflict to support North Korea. The war ended in a 1953 armistice, not a peace treaty, leaving behind a highly militarized border at the 38th parallel and a history of hostility, especially with the US, which North Korea has long seen as an existential threat to its sovereignty. In the 1950s and 1960s, North Korea had tense relationships with its allies during the Cold War. However, its alliances with China and the Soviet Union grew stronger, though the DPRK was careful not to become too dependent on either ally. In exchange, the Soviet Union gave North Korea military help, training, and support. Kim Il-sung tried to find a balance by having ties with China, especially when the Soviet Union broke up. Things were not always easy between the two countries, though. In the 1960s, China's Culture Revolution caused a lot of ideological conflict, and North Korea's desire to be self-sufficient made it even less dependent on Soviet aid for money. In the 1960s, North Korea's nuclear ambitions began to take shape as a way to protect itself and gain power in international relations. When the Soviet Union broke up in 1991, North Korea's main source of income stopped flowing. This caused widespread famine and economic collapse in the 1990s. When North Korea lost Soviet backing, it stepped up its nuclear program as a bargaining chip in international relations, hoping to get help and security guarantees. However, North Korea's repeated nuclear tests led to more isolation and sanctions from the rest of the world. Diplomatic efforts, like the six-party talks that happened from 2003 to 2009, showed promise but failed because North Korea was still determined to get a nuclear weapon. In the last few decades, ties with the US and South Korea. North Korea's relationship with the US has gone back and forth between short diplomatic talks and open animosity since the early 2000s. President George W. Bush called North Korea a member of the Axis of Evil, which made things worse under Kim Jong-un. North Korea continued its nuclear program and conducted numerous missile tests, which led to stricter sanctions. Despite high-profile summits between Kim Jong-un and former US President Donald Trump in 2018 and 2019, no real agreement was reached, and denuclearization talks were put on hold. Relations with South Korea have also changed, with times of peaceful talks being overshadowed by military provocations and missile tests from North Korea. Could you please take a moment to assist us? Please hit the like button if you like our content and leave your thoughts and feedback in the comments to help us grow. Thank you. Modern strategic alignments with China and Russia. Today, North Korea's closest international ties are with China and, more, Russia. North Korea depends on China for trade, economic support, and political support, especially since it has to deal with Western sanctions. China is wary of North Korea's nuclear ambitions and sees the DPRK as a safety net. State against us. Al-Qaeda. South Korea. North Korea has also expanded its relationship with Russia, receiving military and diplomatic support amid shared opposition to Western influence in Asia. These alliances have deepened in recent years, especially as global tensions have polarized relations with the West. The political and financial relationship between China and North Korea has evolved significantly from a close alliance during the Cold War to a more complex and at times strained partnership today. Initially forged during the Korean War when China supported North Korea militarily, the alliance became a critical aspect of China's regional security strategy. This led to the 1961 Sino-North Korean Mutual Aid and Cooperation Friendship Treaty, committing China to defend North Korea in case of an external attack, a commitment renewed in subsequent decades. Through the Cold War, China was a crucial provider of aid supporting North Korea's economy and military. However, the relationship was often marked by tensions as North Korea sought to assert independence under its self-reliance ideology, which sometimes involved distancing itself from Chinese and Soviet influence. Disagreements surfaced during China's Cultural Revolution, with the Chinese Red Guards criticizing North Korean leader Kim Il-sung, straining the alliance. Later, China's opening to the US in the 1970s further unsettled Pyongyang, which felt sidelined by Beijing's shift towards diplomatic pragmatism. Since the 1990s, North Korea has relied heavily on Chinese economic aid, particularly after the Soviet Union's collapse. China is still North Korea's main trading partner and lifeline, providing food and energy to keep the country's economy stable. However, China sometimes backs UN sanctions in response to Pyongyang's recent nuclear tests. China's position shows a balance between keeping North Korea stable as a buffer state and warning it against its nuclear ambitions, which Beijing sees as destabilizing. Now, let's look at the most recent news about North Korea as of October 31, 2012. According to South Korea's Yonhap news agency and information from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, North Korea launched a ballistic missile toward the Sea of Japan early Thursday morning. Japan's defense ministry also saw the launch, and preliminary analysis from Japan's defense authorities showed that the missile was likely to hit the water about 300 kilometers west of Okushiri Island, which is outside of Japan's exclusive economic zone. This happened at 2:36 a.m. Moscow time, or 11:36 p.m. GMT on Wednesday. Government sources said that the missile was probably an intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM, launched on a steep trajectory. Japanese Defense Minister Gen Nakatani said that this missile set a new record for height, flying over 7,000 kilometers, and for the longest flight time, 8 minutes and 6 seconds. While the missile looks like an ICBM, experts are still looking into whether it could be a new type. North Korea launched its 12th missile this year, so Japan's National Security Council held an emergency meeting. A three-stage solid-fuel missile called the Hong-18 was used in North Korea's most recent ICBM test in December 2023. Soldiers from North Korea and Russia. Recent reports say that North Korean soldiers may be involved in Russia's conflict with Ukraine, but official sources from either Moscow or Pyongyang have not confirmed these claims. According to South Korean intelligence, up to 3,000 North Korean troops have been seen in Russian military areas, supposedly getting training before being sent to the front lines in Ukraine. The United States and its NATO partners are very worried about this presence because they think it will mean more support for Russia from other countries. Analysts say that North Korea's involvement could have both strategic and economic reasons. There is also talk that Moscow might give military technology in exchange, but there is no solid proof of this yet. The big military force of North Korea could help Russia, which is having trouble finding enough workers, because North Korean forces could do work or even lead combat in Ukraine. Having North Korean forces take part would have major strategic effects and could make things worse between North Korea and South Korea and Japan. South Korea has said it is ready to help Ukraine more directly if North Korea gets more involved. Western officials are keeping a close eye on the situation, but so far their only reaction has been diplomatic condemnation. They haven't said anything about major policy changes yet. Officials from both the US and NATO are worried about reports that North Korean troops may be helping Russia in the war in Ukraine. There are signs that North Korean soldiers are in Russia and may be getting ready to fight. A spokesman for NATO, Farak Lala, said that if North Korea actively supports Russia in Ukraine, it would be a major escalation that would show how resource-constrained Moscow is. While South Korea is giving briefings to the NATO Council on the situation, it is still hard to come to a firm conclusion because these reports have not been confirmed. However, if North Korea's involvement in Ukraine turns out to be true, it could mean that the conflict gets worse beyond Russia and Ukraine's borders, raising broader security concerns. While we hope that tensions don't rise any further, especially since global stability and peace are becoming more and more important, the current climate leaves room for unpredictability. In these uncertain times, it may be wise to be ready for more than one outcome. That's all for this video. Thank you for watching it. If our content spoke to you or inspired you, please show your support by liking it and subscribing to stay connected with our community.